Hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Raven. Our guest today is Genesis Amaris Kemp. She is a creative content writer and an author. She's a self-development advocate, a visionary, an inclusion and diversity enthusiast. And I love this as part of her bio here. It says, quote, a firecracker and a force to be reckoned with. So before I tell you a little bit more about Genesis, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I am doing well.
Are you feeling like a force or a firecracker today, or both?
Both.
Well, good. So let me tell you a little bit more about Genesis. She is a woman of color. She's a trailblazer who wants others to live out their dreams, goals, and visions. She's the author of a book titled Chocolate Drop in Corporate America, From the Pit to the Palace. So we'll talk about that today. She's been featured on more than 4 dozen podcasts and in magazines. And then she started her own podcast, Gems, with Genesis Amaris Kemp. So I encourage listeners to go check that out wherever you're listening to this podcast. And I hope hosting the podcast has been a good experience for you.
Yes, it's been wonderful. I started off with solo episodes, and then it grew into me interviewing people such like yourself.
Yeah. So I try to remember sometimes I almost have to put a Post-it note on the monitor. Okay, am I interviewer or interviewee? So I'll be interviewing you. It's a conversation. So I'm excited to be having that with you here, Genesis. So, before we talk about other things, I would love to hear your story. What would you say is your favorite mistake?
So my favorite mistake, and I have to chuckle as I'm thinking about it, is whenever I first met my now husband. So we met up for dinner at this restaurant called Brio. So it's an Italian restaurant.
I know it. Yep.
And I literally had just got done reading the book, Think Like a Lady, Act Like a Man. So I was going through all the different characteristics of the woman that I did not want to be. And I was also coming out of, a dry spell of not dating for 2 years because my relationship before was just very taxing because I ended up dating a narcissist and had no idea that I was dating a narcissist until things got bad. And it was time for me to exit stage left or, end up in a bad situation. Mm-hmm. So whenever my now husband... But
yeah, so we probably won't delve deeper into that mistake. We'll just leave it at that, right? Or unless you want to. But so anyway, so sorry, you met your now husband.
Yeah, so I met my now husband, right? And I told him, okay, I don't want to date a guy that has this background. I need a guy with this socioeconomic status. What are your long-term goals? What are your short-term goals? So I had a list of questions. And at the end of that dinner portion, I said, and if this goes right, then I'll go to the movies with you. So then fast forwarding, at the end of the day, he's like, yeah, you're a really great girl. And he sent me this, mind you, via text. You're a great girl. You're just very, I don't think this is going to work. You're just very bossy, just very stern, and just all these other things he kind of said. And I was like, oh, okay, bye. On to the next. And then here we are, 6 years later. We dated for 3 years, been married for 3, and then now we're expanding and having a new addition to our family. So thank you. And I guess it was my perfect mistake because when you first meet somebody, you shouldn't come off very strong where it could cause the other person to shut down because you're getting to know that person just like they're getting to know you, and you shouldn't make assumptions because we've all heard it makes an ass out of you and I. Right. And so I had to learn that the hard way. And in the beginning, it was very challenging for me because I've always been in a male-dominated work field. My background's oil and gas, and so he broke up with me for 4 different times while we were dating. Because he says, are you a woman or a man? Because I'm not going to let you boss me around. And my husband is 8 years older than me. So that is definitely a perfect mistake that I use professionally as well as personally when meeting people. You need to kind of be an observer, then open your mouth and speak versus just coming out just bold and just straight out the gate like you're running a horse race.
Well, so there is an interesting parallel then maybe to job interviews or first day in a workplace. We'll come back to that. But so congratulations on little one is on the way, you said,
Yes.
right? Congratulations on the years of marriage. But there was that part of the story between, okay, this isn't going to work out, bye, as you left Brio. What was was it you giving him another chance or him giving you another chance? What happened at that point?
It was definitely him giving me another chance. So we didn't speak after that message. And then one day there was just like a church event and he was just weighing on me. And I just said, oh, let me just reach out. So I sent him like a scripture and then I would just send him scriptures like throughout like various days. And he thought it was annoying, but he's like, man, this chick is so weird. Then one day I asked him, I was like, hey, do you want to come to church with me? So we're based in Houston and there's this mega church here called Lakewood. So I was like, oh, let's go to Lakewood because that's like a soft introduction for anyone who's not like super religious. It's more like motivational. And so he came and then the funniest thing was I had no idea that his two little brothers went to the same church with their mom because he's from a blended family. So then I got to meet his little brothers and their mom at Lakewood and what a small world. And then she told him, oh, she's the girl for you. I really like her. And she has like a warm spirit. So she kind of gave me that stamp of approval.
Yeah. Good. So I'm curious to go back. I'm familiar with the restaurant. I've eaten at a Brio in a different, in the Fort Worth part of Texas. I'm not familiar with the book. Think Like a Lady, Act Like a Man. Is that a book that's, I guess, for women related to work or love or life in general?
So relationships, it's a book by Steve Harvey, and then they turned it into a comedy. So there's like 2 movies out based on the book, and it's pretty hilarious.
So is Steve Harvey as a man, do you think best positioned to be giving advice to to women or how?
No, so a lot of my guy friends said this book is a joke. You can't take Steve Harvey seriously, and I was like, I know, because it almost ended a relationship. Probably wouldn't have even started if I would have started a different way.
Yeah. Well, sometimes, after a mistake, things find a way of working out, or maybe it's a story of persistence after an initial mistake, or it sounds like a story of second chances.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd be curious, to hear, connecting it back to the workplace, being either in a first interview, I don't know if that's like a first date, maybe, the first day on a job. Like, was there a pattern of being a force, being a firecracker, coming across too strongly in first impressions?
Oh yeah, most definitely. Like I said, my background's oil and gas and energy. So that's a very male dominated workforce.
Right.
So I always had to like kind of hold my own just so I could be, seen as well as heard and, most importantly, taken serious because I don't want them to just think, oh, she's just a young girl just trying to come in here. So my first job in oil and gas was like a small mom and pop. And I began to have some people that were under me whenever I got to a HSC level, which is health, safety, and environmental. I was the manager. And whenever I would tell them, oh, you need to do your JSAs, your job safety analysis before the shifts. And at first they went from seeing me as like their friend because before I got promoted, like I would always chit chat with the shop guys. But then whenever I stepped into that authority, they're like, oh, you're very aggressive. I've had some of the guys call me the B word and other not so nice words because I said, okay, there's a time to have fun and there's a time to be serious. There's a time to separate the personal with the professionalism. And when it's time to work, I want you to do your job and I want you to do a darn good job at it. And just holding your own there. I guess my personality can be very strong and very demanding. And I guess some people say, like, looking at the signs, I'm a Leo, I'm an August baby. So they're like, oh, here she comes roaring. So I'm like, yeah, I guess I'm that lioness.
a lioness, a force, and a firecracker. But I mean, there's that, apparent and long-standing double standard in workplaces, male-dominated or otherwise, where a man who behaves one way gets looked up to, is aggressive, hard-charging, positive.
Yeah.
Yes, there are high fives, and that same behavior, Steve Harvey maybe is alluding to, acting like a man, has negative connotations. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that double standard, and does it apply even more so as a woman of color?
I definitely think the double standards, number one, definitely applies. And then with you being a woman of color, because, like, for example, a guy says the same exact thing I say, he's seen as confident and a go-getter or whatnot. I say the same thing. Some want to label me as, oh, she's aggressive, or she's an angry Black woman, or you're just being very bossy. I've even had other female supervisors pulled me aside and said, hey, the engineers don't want to work with you because you're being very aggressive. I was like, I don't understand how I'm being aggressive when I said the same thing that my counterpart said, but maybe just in a different tone or manner. Because at the end of the day, we're running these $1 million wells, sometimes more than that. And you definitely don't want to screw up like on an oil rig project, because that could you could be in the hole financially. You could lose lives or whatnot. And it's very serious work. And then whenever I switch gears, Mark, and I go from being seen in a upstream setting to working in a chemical plant, and me being the youngest woman, African American, and it was kind of like the redneck culture where there wasn't a lot of people there, and to have an office job and then interact with the people who are down in the unit, that was very hard, because whenever I would say certain things, like, you would see people in the meeting put their head down, their eyes would roll, and it just wasn't receptive there. And it wasn't, I didn't feel like I had the respect that I deserved, even though I had the same credentials and accolades on paper to my male counterparts. So then whenever you try to voice it, they're like, oh, it's not about race. And I was like, well, what else is it about? If it's not about race, and if it's not about gender, then I don't understand why my point isn't being, taken.
There could be the age factor too.
Yeah.
Somebody didn't want to take direction from somebody younger, or it's a combination of those things. And I guess, unfortunately, the bias or the prejudice or the racism lens, it's, through which some people are viewing you, whether it's not even a matter of behavior. I guess that's what leads to the double standards. But sorry, go ahead. I didn't frame that very well as a question.
No. And I was going to say, one way to get around that is just start looking for ways that you're more similar versus trying to accentuate the differences. So, like, I knew, for example, okay, you like this particular food. Okay, I like that food. Or you like this. And I use that to kind of bridge the gap, to like break down those barriers in order for it to be a conducive working relationship. And then at the end of the day, you go your way, I go my way. But at least we have something that we could tie back where we're not like at each other's throat. And, that's a tactic that not everyone is skilled at doing, because they're like, oh, I don't want to know that about my colleague. Like, I don't really care about them. But sometimes you have to care enough in order to, lead the horse to the water.
Yeah. And Genesis, I'd be curious your thoughts. How important is it for you, for people in general, to have a role model or a mentor who's very much like you? So in your case, to have a Black woman of color, well, that's redundant. My most recent mistake, a woman of color, a Black woman as a mentor, sort of how important is that, as opposed to having a mentor who's, let's say, an older white guy?
Semi-important, because if me and her are going through the similar things, like, the only thing that we could share is like the commonalities of different situations that we've endured. But if I have a mentor who does not look like me, then that mentor becomes an ally. And then I'm able to see things from a different vantage point because they could probably give me insight on how people in their group are perceiving me. And then I could kind of give him or her insight on how we perceive them. And then you could kind of see an exchange of ideas, but then you're also introducing that diversity of, gender and culture, but also the diversity of thought as well. Because I don't always want to hang out with people who necessarily look like me, because then we begin to have the same kind of conversations. We're talking about the same inequalities and efficiencies, and that's not necessarily going to get us anywhere, but just maybe comforting. And then with me being first generation American, my dad was South American and my mom is West Indian. So she's Caribbean descent, and some of the people in my family are mixed races. So I've always, had that ability to see other cultures and travel outside of the US and just really see how people should be treated as human beings versus otherwise. And it wasn't until the late 2000s when I had experienced racism in the work setting. And, I remember coming home and crying about it because I had no idea that people would treat someone differently based on the color of their skin.
Was that workplace? So it's terrible hearing about that. Was that something that was not as big of a issue growing up and through school and through college?
No, it definitely wasn't. I went to a tier 1 university where there was definitely foreign exchange students and different people. I went to the University of Houston, and then growing up, I live in Houston. So Houston is a melting pot in general with all types of people. And I grew up in the suburbs. So I always had people who, were different than me, and I got along with them. And, some of my families made the running joke because the guys that I would date were always outside of my race. And when I married my husband, who's also chocolate drop like me, they're like, oh my gosh, he's Black. I said, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Someone pinched me.
Yeah. As we mentioned college, I wanted to ask, as some of the stories that you write about in the book, and again, the title is Chocolate Drop in Corporate America, From the Pit to the Palace. You have degrees in supply chain and logistics. Oh, the Zoom background is fighting the holding up of the book. But yes, we'll and we'll have a photo in the show notes and a link to buy the book. But you wrote about choosing a major and changing majors. I did that a couple of times in college, different engineering disciplines. I'd be curious to hear a little bit about your thought process, or were there fears of kind of making a mistake in finalizing that major?
Oh yeah, most definitely. So when I started in college, my whole entire plan, along with my parents, was for me to go to med school because I always said I wanted to be a pediatrician. And I did actually start off my second job was working at a cancer center. So my first job was real estate and my second one was cancer. So definitely not the fast food route. And I remember getting laid off because they built a new cancer center with all the new equipment, right? So I needed to find another job, and that's how I fell into oil and gas. But I was still pursuing a psychology degree because I wanted that to be the stepping stone to really understand the basis and then continue down the path to eventually apply to med school. And when I transitioned from a smaller company to a big company in oil and gas, my first manager, his name was Scott, and he told me, what do you plan on doing with a psychology degree here at this company? That is a pipe dream. And he's like, if you want to go far with this company, I suggest you change your major. So that's when I had hit the brakes really hard. And I'm like, anyone can use psychology, right? But then I was like, for a older Caucasian male to just give me the blueprint and just lay it on the table, I was like, okay. And at that point, I had no idea what else I wanted to do because everything else was kind of laid out for me. So he's like, go to school the next day. I want you to bring me the degree plans that they have at that campus. So I brought two. One was supply chain and the other one was MECT, which was mechanical engineering and technology. And I was like, oh, I don't want to waste like my parents' money because I had already started taking these psychology classes, right? So I was like, okay, well, if I switch my major to supply chain, then there's a way that I could petition for some of these credits and some of them could be applied with a supply chain degree. So that's what I ended up doing. And the company actually ended up paying for a good portion of my degree when I changed my major. So it was like hashtag winning. And then after that, once I graduated, which I was in honors, I was like, okay, I don't want to be in this admin role anymore. I definitely want to be out in the field doing something that complements my degree. So that's when my second assignment was a raw material coordinator for PP, which is polypropylene.
Yeah. And so you were working your entire way through college in these different jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's an interesting opportunity to get feedback instead of, going straight through school, maybe with a summer internship along the way, where maybe I'd be curious your thoughts of, if that input, that was a useful opportunity, even if that's not what you ultimately end up doing throughout your entire career, utilizing the supply chain and logistics degree.
It was definitely a useful opportunity because when I look back now and I see supply chain as a industry, you could use it anywhere you go, like, oil and gas, medical, that I could always go to the medical field and do something, whether it's procurement or buying or negotiations. And so I was like, you never know where you're going to end up. But as long as you have like a degree and a background with transferable skills, knowledge could always be applied.
And in the book, you write about this challenge, trying to figure out having 3 different job opportunities, and I think for somebody at that point, coming right out of college, the ability to think about trade-offs between short term and long term, like I think that shows a lot of maturity. But can you kind of talk through that thought process of kind of thinking through the trade-offs and choosing that first job after the degree?
Yeah, so there was 3 job offers. One was a low salary, the other one was mid, and the other one was high. And whenever I looked at the options, I not only looked at the demographics of the company, meaning, okay, how long have they been in business? Do they have international ties? I think I looked at the stocks a little bit, and then I also looked at the benefits, like what are the company benefits, like insurance wise as well as perk wise. And then the option I went with was actually the lowest paying one, which is where I stayed for 7.5 years. One, because that company was around the longest, so it would be branded by association. And I knew if I had that company on my resume and I wanted to go anywhere else, that I would quickly get a job because that company did a good job with T&D, which is training and delivery. Their metrics spoke for itself. They were on different charts for being ranked very highly competitor wise and etc. But then in the vanity part, I really wanted to go with the highest salary because I was like, oh, where the money resides. But then I was like, you know what? Money doesn't always equal happiness. Money is a conduit to provide for what you want, but it may not necessarily fill your needs and give you that overall happiness. So that's another differentiation factor that I use. And then also being as young as I was, I said, okay, well, if I went with this company that I chose, not only did they have a 401k, but they also had a pension. And a lot of companies nowadays have done away with their pension. And so I thought, okay, this was the best option for me at that time. And then even though I'm no longer with that company, when I did get laid off in February last year, not only did I get my 401k, but I also got the pension, which was money that I did not contribute out of my own pocket. And so I was like, okay, so I'm actually gaining something, even though I didn't go in with the expectations of, grabbing all of that money that was on the table.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there were trade-offs between like short-term and long-term. We're trying to find the balance of, it sounds like you were being very analytical, but then there's also maybe a time for gut feel, or which do we think is the right job, or which feels like the right job? How do you kind of work through that balance?
So with that balance, I come from a religious and spiritual home. So we prayed on it, like
Mhm.
my family and they were in alignment with the decision that I made. So that helped me with my gut instinct and that overall intuition.
Yeah, well, it's good to have that the I don't know if the influence or that input or the strength that comes from that to feel confident in that decision, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So one other line in the book, one of the other things I kind of pulled out from the book was you talk about chocolate drops, and you talk about old vanilla males, quote unquote. And I'm old, yeah, well, I'm an older vanilla male. So that label or that phrase would apply to me here. And there, you write about how there are different rules, and I would acknowledge, that. It's something we're still all, I think, trying to struggle through. But I wanted to ask you, because we're recording this the day after we can now say Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was officially confirmed. I'm guessing you were following that closely, and I'm curious your thoughts, kind of using the comparison in the book about different rules, your observations or thoughts on our newest Supreme Court justice, and the comparison of her treatment to previous nominees who were old vanilla males.
So I felt with her, since she was the only woman of color and just making history, or now the new term is making her story, which
Mm-hmm.
is like she's making her story, which is
Mm-hmm.
history. They held her on a different pedestal than they did some of the older vanilla males, and some people even threw out nasty comments that, oh, she only got there because of X, Y, and Z, or she's not gonna be a good leader, or whatever the case may be. And I had to ask, well, if you strip away, her outward appearance and her physical anatomy, would you say the same thing about her running mates?
Mm-hmm.
And if you wouldn't, then can you allude back to say that it was, a cop-out statement, or it could be race derived? And I feel like with her being in the Supreme Court, it's giving women who look like me and younger girls a fighting chance that if she can do it, they can achieve it as well. Because I think the statistic said no one in 50 years has ever been colored in the Supreme Court. I can't remember if that was the actual thing, so don't quote me on that. But I was like, wow, why did it take so long to have, number one, a woman, and then a person of color? And is it due to the unconscious biases, or is it due because we never really had someone who, really fit the credentials, or whatever the case may be? Because we've seen time and time again, there has been so much racist rhetoric in this country that it's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And there's still not only in against races, but even within your own community, there's colorism and racist between someone who looks like me and maybe someone who's a little darker than me. I hope, does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah. No, I mean, it was an open-ended question to hear your thoughts and observations on the process, and maybe just as a follow-up question, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this question of some complain. This is not me complaining, but some complain of President Biden, when he was a candidate, made a pretty strong commitment that he was going to appoint the first Black woman to the Supreme Court, mm-hmm. and he followed through on that pledge. And there's qualification and that qualifier, and then some people unfortunately, I think only look at the qualifier to your point. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on, your thoughts of, that commitment to sort of undo some historical injustices of the white men having the advantage for forever. Does that, I don't know, I'm stumbling through the question because I'm sure it's complicated. So let me just try to turn back over to you of does that commitment to say, yes, we need more diversity, whether it's here or in workplaces, does that at sometimes risk taking away from the accomplishments, whether they're academic or job related accomplishments beyond gender and race?
I think so, because if you're saying, oh, I'm giving this person a slot because they check the diversity box, then you're taking away meritocracy, because maybe they got there based on their merits and not based on how they look. But if you're saying, oh, I'm putting this person in this position because they are a woman and they're a woman of color, or they're Hispanic or they're Asian, then that's tokenism. And you're using that individual to be a token. So you could show outwardly that you are complying with diversity, equity, inclusion. And now the new addition is B, which is belonging. Mm-hmm. But then if you look at their qualifications and their qualifications do not align with the position that they are being slotted for, then can you accurately say that you're making the best decision for the workplace as a whole, for the government as a whole, or etc.? And I feel like we need to stop trying to fit people into these boxes and break down these walls and these barriers and put the best individual for that particular position in that slot versus trying to just check a box. We need to move the needle forward and get away from this check the box syndrome, because we're missing out on so many qualified candidates.
So when it comes to workplaces, are there mistakes that organizations make when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are maybe the most common mistake that companies should learn from and avoid repeating?
So one, gender gap is one. The second mistake I've seen is pay disparities, because looking at the weight, and I'll use myself. So it wasn't until I spoke up after the whole entire BLM movement, which is the Black Lives Matter movement, that my company gave me a $20,000 salary increase after speaking up. And then my CL, which is classification level, was bumped from a 15 to a 22. 1 week after, I just voiced my personal stance with racism that I've endured, and then the professional side in the vice president's meeting, because he called on me and he asked what my opinion was, and I just kind of shared my story. And 1 week later, I get a phone call that was telling me that I'm getting, a bump in salary, and it's not like a minor bump. That's a huge bump, $20,000. And then, my classification level. So that's one thing. So you have the gender gap, you have the pay disparity, and then you also have, the issues that ERGs go through. And ERGs are employee resource groups. And if you have different groups for each racial sector, then that creates more division, because those groups may have this similar problem across the board. But if they're separated, versus bringing them together to kind of share what some of the common denominators are, then can we really say that we're achieving something change-wise?
Yeah. And so with that pay bump, do you think they discovered a pay disparity that could have been gender-based or race-based or both?
Oh, yeah. Most importantly. Because I was the only one on my team that was African-American. And of course, I was a woman. And whenever we had a global trade regs meeting, they made a mistake by flashing up like a bar to kind of show the progression of the group. And my colleagues all were starting at a CL level of a 22 and higher. And when I looked on the screen, a CL 15 was not there, but I was doing the work of my peers. So that's how I knew there was a big pay disparity.
Mm-hmm.
And when I brought that issue up to not only my supervisor, but her boss, he said, oh, we're looking into it. We've actually been trying to, kind of figure out how to, get your salary increase. It's just very hard because the way you came in, from us. And I just heard just so much bull crap. It was unbelievable. And I was like, supervisors do have the leeway to make changes if they want to, but if their hand is not forced into doing it, don't expect them to go out to bat for you, because then if something were to backfire, then it would kind of be their neck or whatever on the line, however you want to say it.
Yeah. So hopefully that company learns from that situation and through hiring decisions and salary offers doesn't create other disparities in the future. It's one thing to make that adjustment for you to look and say, oh, we fixed it for Genesis, but does that really fix the system that leads to disparities?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, again, our guest today is Genesis Amaris Kemp. Her book, again, is titled Chocolate Drop in Corporate America, From the Pit to the Palace. And let's talk before we wrap up about your podcast, Gems with Genesis Amaris Kemp. What prompted you to start the podcast? What kind of topics and things are you talking about there?
So when I lost my dad in November of 2020 due to medical negligence, that really prompted me to start the podcast, where I just started to talk in the mic about my grief journey and what it felt like to lose my best friend, my dad, and the person who has always been there for me and been my biggest supporter. So that it was just so hard. And it was hard to talk to some of my close family members and friends because they kept saying, I know how you feel. And I'm like, you possibly can't know how I feel because both of your parents are still living. So you don't know what it's like to lose a parent. And I just, even from the religious standpoint, some people were just giving me these scriptures that I'm like, I don't want to hear that. Like, yes, I know, like, oh, the Lord is good. And, he give it and he take it away and all of that stuff. And I'm like, how can a person who absolutely loves God and is super religious, would, been in ministry, would give the shirt off his back to someone, just go through something so gruesome as medical negligence. And I'm not going to go into the details right now. And then after I did so many different episodes, a lot of people were saying how it resonated with them because we were in the height of the pandemic. The pandemic was just jumping off. And I said, well, I wasn't really doing it for other people. I was doing it for myself as a way to alleviate and just really go through the grief journey. Then I got on Podmatch, and there was one guy in particular. He was just so persistent in reaching out, and he kept saying, oh, I want to be on your podcast. I want to be on your podcast. Then I had that aha moment, or some would say discernment or intuition, where I let him come on, and we did a segment, and I just asked like questions, conversation flow. And then it just took off from there, the interviews parts. And now it's ranked in the top 3% globally. The topics that I talk about complement my core pillars, which are to educate, inspire, and motivate. And then, of course, since I'm a big passionate person about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, those are some of the dots that I like to connect and bridge the gap. So I welcome male and female on the show, people of different backgrounds. I've had Christians on, I've had agnostics on, I've had people of, other religious groups, because a conversation is just that, a conversation. And by just being transparent, that's where the transformation can take place, and you can learn from one another, even though there are differences. Yeah.
Well, that's great. And I think, our conversation today, it's an opportunity for me to learn from your perspectives and your experiences, and opportunity for the listeners to hear that, and they can hear more in the podcast. What's the origin of calling it Gems?
So I believe that we all are here as gems, and we all have something amazing to leave in the world. And if you think about gems, you kind of look at the logo behind me, it's in the shape of a diamond. So if you never go through the pressures of life, you're never going to come out on the top with that refinement. And it's just like whenever they're mining for gold or diamonds or whatnot, it has to go through the pressure in order for that beauty to be birthed.
Hmm. That's very well said. And congratulations on the success with the podcast. I'm sorry that it was born out of grief and medical negligence. The whole idea of medical error is an important subject to me. It's a huge problem that often goes unrecognized and unaddressed. So I'm sorry that your father had to go through that. I'm sorry that you and others in your family had to go through that. So thank you for sharing some of that with us today, and thank you for sharing your perspectives and kind of your experiences that led to the book, mistakes that ended up turning out okay. So this is your first child that's on the way?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sure there are all sorts of potential parenting mistakes that you'll be working to avoid, but more importantly, learning from whatever parenting mistakes I'm sure are bound to happen.
I'm in for the roller coaster ride.
Well, best wishes to you and your growing family. Again, our guest has been Genesis Amaris Kemp. And again, as it said in her bio, thank you for being a firecracker and a force to be reckoned with today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mark, for having me.